So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today for horrornews.net. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my name is J. Blake Fichera, and I had a book come out in 2016 called Scored to Death: Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers. And then just a month or two ago, I had a second book come out called Scored to Death 2: More Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers. And in between that, I did Scored to Death, the podcast. And basically, what they all do is they're collections of interviews that I do with composers who have made significant contributions to the horror genre.
And you're actually a musician also.
Well, and not these days because of COVID, but
COVID,
I play guitar and I sing, and I've had a blues band in New York City. I don't know, for 15 years maybe, and was lucky enough to be inducted into the New York Blues Hall of Fame a couple of years ago. But even before COVID, so many clubs and things were closing even before all this. So it's been a little harder to get good gigs, but still trying.
That's incredible, though, and congratulations on the New York Blues Hall of Fame.
Thank you.
So how did you get into horror? Have you always been a horror fan? And then how did you sort of get into composition and composing and writing the books?
Well, I mean, I don't think I was a conscious horror fan always. I mean, I think I grew up, I was a kid in the 80s, kind of came into my formative years in the 90s. So I consider myself a part of the video store generation, but also cable and paid cable kind of were coming into, they're gaining their powers in the 80s. And so I think specifically kids of my generation were exposed to things that previous generations weren't, and that there was just availability by going out and renting things or catching things on HBO and Cinemax. And in Philadelphia, there was a channel called Prism, which also showed movies. And CDs also had a lot of great horror television. There was kind of revamps of The Twilight Zone and Hitchcock Presents, and then Outer Limits later in the later 80s, early 90s. And then you had things like Tales from the Crypt and Tales from the Dark Side. And there was even a short-lived show, which I absolutely fell in love with as a kid, called Werewolf on Fox, that only lasted about a season. But I fell madly in love with werewolves and had to go to the library and get books about werewolves when that show was on. But I never would have considered myself like a horror kid at that point. It just was one of the many things that was available and that I was into. And then when I was in high school and stuff, my friends and I started renting movies on our own. And then there was a period of time where we rented a lot of horror movies on Friday nights. I remember that. And that's when I saw a lot of the great horror movies that I hadn't seen already. But also around this time, you have to take into account that, horror had become mainstream in a way that it had never become before. Characters like Freddy Krueger and Jason were like pop culture icons. And then Chucky and in the early 90s or mid 90s, there had 2 seasons of syndicated award ceremony, the Horror Hall of Fame. And I remember seeing those as a kid. So this is a long way to get around, like, yes, always a horror fan, maybe not always consciously a horror fan. And then in the mid 90s, I rented a movie with my friends called In the Mouth of Madness by John Carpenter. And kind of my life changed after that. The soundtrack, the score by Carpenter and Jim Lang was the first horror movie score that I ever bought with my own money. I remember buying it in Tower Records in South Street in Philadelphia. I remember finding it and being excited. And that kind of got the ball rolling as a John Carpenter fan. And then in the late 90s, I went to film school. And I think partially just being introduced things by your peers, things that your friends in your film school class had seen. The first time being in a group of people that loved cinema as much as I did, that was kind of the biggest thing for me about film school, is just meeting new people that were equally as excited about it, and then being introduced to things that I never even knew about by them, let alone all like the film history classes that you took. So I think being introduced to horror films that they liked, and then part of a little bit of a rebellious thing against some of the film history stuff that I was being introduced to, I started to really take horror seriously. So like 97, 98 was when like I went headfirst into really studying horror. And that introduced me to the films of like Dario Argento and Fabio Frizzi, which led me to fall in love with the music of Goblin. And I mean, the films of Lucio Fulci, which led me to love the music of Fabio Frizzi, and introduced me to all the Italian horror movies and the Italian horror scores, more importantly, for what we're talking about. So this all started, like, the love for horror music all started because of this love for horror movies. But film music itself was always something that I listened to. I was, being a kid of that generation, my parents had like the Star Wars score, so John Williams was a big thing for me. My dad listened to some scores on record and on tape. So film scores were always just like another form of music that got listened to just like anything else. So it was never weird for me to be into film scores, like when I discovered In the Mouth of Madness, and then from there got, the score for Halloween, and then later Goblin. It was all happening. It just like, it all intensified in like my late teens. And that love just like never died. So flash forward like 20 years later, I just was still into it. Goblin had kind of reformed as a lineup called New Goblin at the time. So we're talking about 2012, 2013. And they played in Brooklyn. I live in New York City, and I went to go see them. And it was just like, it blew my mind. I never thought I would be ever see any form of Goblin live, let alone, at least half the original band. And it was just a lot of that. It's like everything. I always call everything like a perfect storm, because things happen for me like in like waves, but like things just come together almost like lightning in a bottle. And so I was just like way into horror scores again, like anything, when you're into something, or you listen to like one album over and over again, and then you put it down for a couple of years, and then you pick it back up. And that kind of happened. And then Goblin was the thing again for me. Always listened to him, but got very intensely listened to him, sparked by that show. And that kind of gave me the inspiration of like, hey, I want to know more about these guys. They're like an obscure Italian progressive rock band. There's just not a lot of information about them here in the States anyway. And so that got the ball rolling of like, okay, well, how do I find out this information? It doesn't exist. Maybe I could reach out to some of them and interview them. But if I'm going to do that, who else I'm interested in is John Carpenter and Fabio Frizzi. And it just like, it snowballed into this thing where it really just was about me wanting to know more about the process and the music and these people who I admired as a musician myself, but also as a fan of their work. And next thing I knew, I was just interviewing a bunch of composers, and that's how the first book came to be, as just someone hungry for knowledge, I guess.
That's incredible. And I think because horror doesn't always get the really great respect that I think it deserves, because there are so many films that are just so beautiful by themselves. And then when you add on the scores and the different compositions, like Christopher Young, for example, I mean, mind blown. He's incredible.
Yeah.
But when you decided to write the books, did you sort of take into account, did you kind of know who you were going to talk to, or was it sort of just how is the process is where I'm going? with
Well,
my
it was
rambling questions.
there was a couple of things. There were some criteria, which was like, who am I a fan of?
Mhm.
Who do I who do I want to know more about? And also, when it became clear that I was going to be assembling enough of them that it could be a book, diversity became something that was important to me. It doesn't maybe seem like it if you just read the list of names and you see the pictures, and the diversity becomes even bigger part of the second book. But it was about like age and style was the diversity I was going for. There was it. The first book is heavily weighted in people whose careers started in the 70s and 80s, but I wanted to make sure I got guys like Joseph Fichera and Nathan Barr and Jeff Grace, whose careers started in like the 90s and into the 2000s. Try to cover at least a little bit of that, but also guys who were known for orchestral scores and also guys who were known for synthesized scores. So it was a lot of that. There was a part of that, like anything, you interview people. There's also just the like, who can I reach out? Who can I find contact information to, or who gets back to me? There was some of that. But the first book was just like, okay, I'm going to reach out to John Carpenter. I got very lucky in that the majority of my interview with John Carpenter for the book was done 6 months before he even announced that he was going to put out an album of unfilm related music. So I got him at a time when he wasn't like sick of talking about his music. I got him at a time when whenever he talked about his music, it was a small part of a bigger conversation about his filmography. And I got to talk to him for like over an hour just about his music. And I think he was into it and then the albums come out and the book hasn't come out yet. So I reached back out. I said, look, well, now he's got these albums. Can I do an update? And by then he had talked to, hundreds of websites and stuff about his music because he was promoting an album. And it was like night and day, his enthusiasm to talk about that stuff. So I got very lucky. Timing was actually on my side for the whole process of the first book because I was going to say unbeknownst to me, I was a little aware of it, but I wasn't as aware of it as I would become later after the book comes out. The first book came out, which is I was aware that like Mondo had started re-releasing some horror scores and like Death Waltz was doing it over, in the UK. But like, when I started the first book, maybe Waxwork put out their first record. So like I started the process in late 2013. By the time the book came out, the first book came out in 2016, that we had like all these wonderful like boutique record labels, like beautifully restoring these scores and putting them out on vinyl. Like the book came out like at the crest of the wave of this resurgence of film scores. So there was just something kind of in the air or in the water at the time where like people were getting excited about it, including me. And obviously like that started beforehand, or like a band like Goblin couldn't have toured America and sold out a venue if the internet hadn't kind of like laid the foundation for people to find this stuff more easily. Because when I started collecting it, it was like, yeah, there was the internet, but there wasn't any Napster or anything. You were on like, there wasn't social media. You were on like horror forum boards being like, hey, does anybody have like this? And you were like snail mailing, copies of stuff to each other because things just weren't available here. And even though Amazon existed at that point, it wasn't like the powerhouse, and eBay was new. And you were like, that was like, because I could buy something from somebody in Italy then, but that was all like kind of new when I started getting into all this stuff. By 2016, it was like, night and day. There was like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and there was these labels, and you could just order stuff online and you could order all this stuff. So it was like, I got very lucky with timing. And it just, in terms of who was in the book. It was, like I said, it was just like, that's obviously thinking that that was going to be the only book about the subject I ever wrote. I did want to like say, okay, like, well, what are like the, also, what are the popular films? What are the popular franchises? Okay, Nightmare on Elm Street, Charles Bernstein, I'll reach out to him. Hellraiser, Christopher Young, I'll reach out to him. Friday the 13th, Harry Manfredini, I'll reach out to him. And one thing that I didn't realize at the time is that like film music composers, and especially horror film composers, are the most generous and awesome group of people. I think it's because they don't get the recognition they deserve. And I think they're happy to get that recognition like anybody would be. So I think they're excited when you want to talk to them about their work, just like anybody would be. And not more people now than when I started wanted to talk to them about their work. So the first book was such an amazing experience in terms of like meeting these people, even though it was just over the phone at first. After I finished, I went to California and I did get to meet a bunch of them in person and become fairly close friends with a handful of the guys from the first book. But it was just like they were great. And I wanted to continue that process. So I said to my publisher, why don't we do another one? And they're like, well, let's wait a year. Let's see if anybody buys the first one, which in retrospect makes a lot of sense. But I wasn't done. So I kind of waited a year. And when the verdict came down that they weren't going to do another one, so this was like 2017, I said, okay, well, I'm not done. How else can I do this? So that's how Scored to Death, the podcast, started, was kind of a continuation / companion to the first book, reaching out to people I wanted to talk to. In some ways, a more relaxed format, because it was like I did try to keep a schedule for the first year, but and then eventually, oddly enough, the opportunity to do the second book came along. And how the second book kind of came to be was because I had a bunch of great interviews that I thought were great for the Scored to Death, the podcast. The second book came to be like half kind of transcriptions with updates. So there's some like bonus material of those interviews that I did from a handful of the interviews that I did from the podcast. And then because I didn't want the book to just be things that were available elsewhere for free, half the book is all new stuff. And when I said earlier, diversity became kind of more of a important thing for me. It was one, there was a bunch of scores that had come out as I was finishing the second book, and in between them, like It Follows, Get Out. There was like a new crop of contemporary composers to talk to. But it was also like the first book is all like white men. And partially that's because it's about film in general is a white male driven the industry is kind of biased that way. So it was important to me to change it up as much as I could for the second book. And I got very lucky in that I found the music of Holly Amber Church, whose music I fell in love with. And she kind of checked off a lot of boxes for me in terms of like, her music's great. I love it. Two, she's awesome to talk to. She's super nice. She is working, especially when I interviewed her, in like kind of a more independent film arena. Because that's also something, part of the diversity that even went back to the first book, which is like, okay, we have people doing like big budget horror, like studio horror movies, but how does that differ? How does the process differ for someone who's working with a much smaller budget? And so, I'm positive that, Holly's career will explode into bigger things. But at the time, she was doing a lot of these smaller horror movies. And so I wanted to talk to somebody that did that. And, of course, Michael Abels did Get Out and Us, and he's African American, but he's also coming from a completely different area of music. He was like a classical composer who had a whole career as that before he became a film music composer. He wasn't
Right.
like a guy who started composing music for film when he was like 20. It was just a lot of it was just, the diversity was just vast in a lot of ways with people like that. Rob, who's French, who did like the remake of Maniac and Gretel and Hansel. And then the other area was like, okay, the first book had a lot of Americans and some Italians. What's another region where horror is very popular in? Asia was the obvious choice. Of course, unfortunately, there was a huge language barrier, but getting to interview, even in a small capacity, composers like Koji Endo and Kenji Kawai was amazing in that, like, there's almost nothing about them here. So even though the language barrier caused my interviews with them to be not nearly as in depth as they are with a lot of the other composers in the books, the fact that I was able to bring something about them to English language audiences was exciting and important to me, because ultimately, something that you and I talked about before we started recording, like, aside from like my own personal gratification of like getting to know these guys and in a professional sense of like interviewing them, it became the part of the mission became very early on, because they're so great, to like spread the word and kind of promote them. And ultimately the books are my way of promoting the art form and also them, and trying to bring them to the forefront for horror fans, because horror fans are great and a lot of them love the music and they know who they are. But like you're saying, I think sometimes on things like social media and Twitter, it's easy for us to forget that, like, on social media, we're in a bubble. So horror seems really big to us on there because we follow all these other horror lovers. But ultimately, like, once you get outside that bubble, like, nobody knows who these people are. So it became kind of also like a personal mission to kind of promote them. And I've always said this even about the first book, like, to me, the books, like, I share ownership with them. Like, they're not just my book, because yes, I'm the person throughout the book, but each chapter is about someone who's amazing, an amazing and talented artist who deserves recognition. So in my mind, always, like, those books belong to us, the composers in them, as well as myself. And that's really been the mission, not just as a fan, but as an appreciator of art, and wanting to get credit for people that deserve it. That's the books are important to me for that reason.
I think that sometimes when you watch a horror movie and then you kind of think about it later on, a lot of times it's always the scores and the soundtrack that sort of stick with me. Like, when I think about Rosemary's Baby, always comes to mind, thinking about that. And obviously Friday the 13th, the soundtrack and the that kind of thing. But does that sort of stick with you as a horror fan when you're listening and you kind of think, oh, that was a great scene when you hear that song? Because that kind of happens to me. Like, I'll hear, because I have a playlist of listening to like Christopher Young and all these incredible composers. And I'll hear something and I'll go, oh my gosh, that was a great scene. But I love that music.
Yeah, I think music in film in general, and probably also any kind of like, theater in a dramatic narrative storytelling sense, I think is completely underrated. And I think most people don't even realize the importance of it until maybe it's taken out. And then you see what it would be like without it. I mean, that's very literally invisible, like, in some ways, you could argue like the best music is the stuff you don't even notice because you're so in the movie that you don't even know that there is music. So music, I mean, it's and a lot of this appreciation, even though I always love film music, has come from talking to these composers and learning about how music does work and how they think about it. One thing that I did kind of discover in talking to all these composers is, even though some of them don't think music is really different in horror than in other genres, at least they don't think about it that way. You know, they're just scoring us, they're aiding a story, and whatever that story is, it's like the same process for them. But music in horror movies does have, like, the relationship of music in horror movies is very unique. It's more active a lot of the times. It has a lot more to do sometimes. And I think part of one of the things that makes it interesting to listeners is that the genre itself allows for no limitations in music. You know, like, you can't really score like a romantic comedy with, you know, household tool, you know, utensils or a trash can and a pan, you know, frying pan or something. But you could make a horror movie score that way. They're not all that, but I think that the genre itself, and you could, you know, sci-fi is also a genre that I think there are other genres that are more adventurous, but horror itself, just like, I think it was Harry Manfredini who told me once that, you know, the thing about horror is, like, you can, you know, you can use anything in the kitchen and the kitchen sink kind of thing. Like, it could be anything. It could be experimental, but yet you could have something like Hellraiser by Christopher Young, which is this gorgeous symphonic score. And sometimes, like, one of my favorite scores is The House on Sorority Row by Richard Band, which we talk about in Richard Band is in the second book. And part of one of the things that music can do, which I think is really important for low budget horror movies, is kind of like raise the production value, like kind of elevate the way, like, The House on Sorority Row is this, like, lush, beautiful orchestral score for a good but pretty standard 80s slasher movie. And so that score has always stood out to me because it's always been like a cut above the rest of a lot of the other scores that were happening. And it stands, and it's unique. So, you know, just music also just has a lot of different roles in horror movies. Like, you know, like the Harry Manfredini, like Mama is the kind of the same usage as the Jaws theme, in that, like, it's a way of keeping the threatening presence of the killer, and whether it's a shark or a human killer, like, present in a movie when you don't see them. Like, music is fulfilling, like, they're the killer. And that's something that doesn't happen very often in other kinds of film. And I also think, like, there's also something to more what you're saying, in that, like, horror, I think, taps into something that's a little more primal than a lot of other genres. And so it's almost like, you know, on a subconscious level, like, that music becomes like Pavlovian, you know, like Pavlov's dogs. Like, we can hear that music outside of the movie, and it, like, I think we do get like a little bit of an endorphin rush or something, like chemical happens sometimes with some of that music, because we associate it with, like, these heightened, excitable moments. In the same way, though, that, like, you know, I could listen personally, like, Rocky's my favorite movie of all time. So, like, if I hear some of Bill Conti's cues from the original Rocky movie, like, it can literally bring me to tears because of its connection to that story and the drama that happens in that movie. So music is like this amazing thing that, like, kind of like plays with your brain, and it does, like, I think it lives in the subconscious somewhere. And for us horror fans, we can, we'll eat that up. Like, that's why I think horror fans in a general sense are more film music fans than maybe other genres, because like we're thrill seekers to a certain extent, and that music is like a little shot of it, is like a little taste.
I think it invokes fear. Like when you talk about the Jaws in general, when you hear the music, there's that instant almost like, oh my God, like what's happening? And even randomly the Howling, I keep thinking about that soundtrack because it's very subtle,
No.
yet there's something completely terrifying coming. And like Psycho and Halloween, and just instantly you hear these kind of the sounds and the soundtracks and what's happening, and it invokes some kind of feeling like fear, or oh my gosh, or what is that? And I think that
Well,
that's very
there's
powerful.
that's definitely like horror. Also, one of the roles that music has to play in horror, aside from like the jump scares or like the truly terrifying like chase scenes of like, momentum of the story, is that like it does also fulfill a lot of atmosphere. Like there's just a lot of places where it's just there to kind of like tweak the atmosphere and make it unsettling. And those subtle moments are obviously just as important as like the big chase scene where like, you know, where like Laurie Strode is running away from Michael Myers, like
Mhm,
dun
mhm.
dun dun. But like that, some of that more subtle music is kind of just as important. It's just I think also because of the nature of so much horror, especially in the 80s, being so low budget, like those limitations on what could be done uh financially with a music budget, I think also just like stretched. That's why like, synthesizers probably may have never become as big a part of like the film scoring process if it wasn't for like the demand that decreasing budgets in the 80s, mostly for horror movies, kind of put on. Like, okay, how do we get like a big sound with one guy in a studio? We will use this new technology that's coming out. And it kind of, in a weird way, like horror, I think, pushed like elevated like the evolution of like electronic music in some ways to fill kind of this demand for like these straight to video horror movies and stuff. Obviously started with the Halloween and John Carpenter saying like, okay, like I'm the cheapest guy to do this. But how could I do this and sound big? Okay, we'll do this. That later become, I eventually asked John when in the book, at some point I said, at some point you're working with budgets where you can hire other people. Like you
Mhm.
didn't like Friday the 13th managed to have like like a somewhat orchestral score of live players. And John said, well, it also just became like another stamp for him as a filmmaker. Like it was just like more of like pushing his tourism on the movie. Obviously, there are fantastic films that he directed that he didn't score, like The Thing, for instance, with Ennio Morricone, and Starman with Jack Nitzsche. But it became like the Carpenter sound, which is having a big resurgence, especially now that he's a rock star and has toured and played live. It's there's just I mean, obviously, I could talk about it forever. There's just so many things that music does in horror movies, and kind of the importance of music, and why I think we kind of love it as fans. It was fascinating, and some of that obviously, like, it piqued my interest enough to pursue the books. But in doing the books and interviewing these people, like, it's just made me even more passionate about it, and it, opens up so many more questions about it for me. But also just it makes me excited to be able to share their knowledge and experience with people that are interested in it, because I think it's important.
Now, you do have two great books so far. Are you going to do another one?
I don't know. It's I'll never say never. I mean, I needed a break, so right now I'm actually I've taken a break from podcasting. There's a chance that I might start doing some podcasting stuff. For a while there, I for a year I was asked to kind of take over as host of a podcast called Cuts from the Crypt, where I basically was
Mhm.
a DJ and I got to just play some of my favorite horror movie cues for an hour. I might do something like that again for a while. One, to help promote the second book. Two, it's fun. It's a little less labor intensive than some of the interviewing. Uh, the interviewing stuff, actually, the interviewing itself is not labor intensive. That's amazing. But it's everything that comes, as you know, as someone that interviews people. It's like, okay, then you either have to transcribe it or you have to edit it. Or then the work starts after you've already done the part that you, the reason why you wanted to do it. So I might do something film music related, more in like a music, in playing music, kind of working towards that for a little while. Other than that, I'm kind of taking a break from anything too strenuous. I, for 6 years while I was writing these books, also co-hosted a movie podcast called Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers. And just between writing books and interviewing composers for podcasts and doing that podcast, like I didn't even realize how busy I was for, 6+ years until they're like, okay, let's take a break. It's been like amazing to like sit down and watch a movie for pleasure, not as research for something. Um, or just like be able to pick up my guitar and have time to noodle around with it myself, for just to relax. So there's a very good chance another book may eventually come to be, because there are so many more composers I'd love to talk to. So I definitely don't think my work in the field of interviewing composers is over. Whether that continues as in podcast form or book, I don't know yet. But for right now, I have no immediate plans other than just kind of relax and maybe listen to some music.
You also taught at film school.
I went to a film program at the time, was probably the best undergraduate film program. It was at a small college called SUNY Purchase. And a couple of years after that, I had the opportunity to go back and teach kind of film history classes to non-film majors. So it wasn't people in the film program, but it was people outside the film program. And I did, for 3 years, I taught a horror class, a class about horror movies there. And for one semester, I taught a similar class about comedy. And that was a love-hate relationship with that. One, I was an adjunct professor, so it like the amount of work that I put into it was not justified by the pay I was getting. I also lived in like New York City and didn't have a car, so it was like public transportation. It was like 2 hours each way for me to do it for like 3 hours a week. I would have continued it. It's funny. They ended up stopping those classes for a few years. And when they brought that class back, they hired, instead of asking me to come back and do it, they hired Jeff Lieberman, who directed like Squirm and
Mhm.
Blue Sunshine. And he did
Mhm.
it for a year. And I've gotten to know Jeff fairly well because of that, because they gave him one of my old syllabuses to look at, which had my phone number on. So he called me to ask me about the class. And
Mhm.
so it was weird. I talked to this guy on the phone for like an hour, and he's like, well, I directed a few horror movies. And I was like, well, which ones did you direct? And he was like, Squirm. I was like, oh, you're the Jeff Lieberman. And so that kind of started like a weird friendship. And he wrote a quote for the first book. So that class, and then I think eventually I think he might have only done it for a year or two, because it was a tough rack, because you're also not teaching people that necessarily love movies. You're kind of, some of them are just people that are hoping to get credit. to watch movies, and they don't really care too much about the topic. So it was a tough one, but it was definitely an experience that I'm glad I had. And I think I probably learned more than they did because of the amount of research that I had to do to prepare for those classes. I think was partially what like got me into the field of like writing about film for websites and magazines. And I wrote for a blues website for a long time. And I interviewed people there, but like that kind of all started because of like reading books to prepare myself for those horror movies. So it was definitely an invaluable experience. It was just a tough one.
What would you want to say to people that are going to read the books? What do you kind of want them to know from your perspective?
Well, I would say outside of the horror fan, I think having it be labeled like Scored to Death Conversations with Horror's Greatest Composers, some of horror's greatest composers, is kind of a double-edged sword, because it's, you know, horror fans are great. They're very passionate, and I'm one of them. And so like this book is, you know, for me, a love letter to the composers in it, but also a love letter to the fans who love it, and an attempt to help answer the questions, obviously answer the questions that I had, but I had to assume doing that, especially when I did the first book kind of in a vacuum, not knowing if anybody was going to care about the first one, assuming that there was other people that wanted those questions answered. But outside of the horror fan, I think one thing, the bad side about it being labeled horror is that I think there is so much fantastic information for people that aren't horror fans, that are just film music fans in general, or film music composers who aren't even interested in horror movies. I think it's a wonderful resource of information for people that are just passionate about music, maybe not even film, or people that are passionate about film and not even music. So, I mean, that would be my big thing. Like, you know, I would say like 25% of the books is about horror.
Mm-hmm.
You know, 75% of the books is about like creative process, how music itself works in film, how a composer creates music. You know, it's like really not about horror movies. I mean, yes, you get to learn a lot about George Romero in the second book because of the people I interview, or you get to learn about John Carpenter, you get to learn about Dario Argento. You get to learn about these amazing filmmakers and about those specific films. But ultimately, it's about creativity. And it's just a kind of a portrait of these artists. So that's the thing that I wish was easier to sell the book to people that might not look at it because they're afraid, because they're just not interested in horror movies.
Do you think you would ever consider kind of like maybe making a documentary about how you did this process, and sort of like what, I don't want to say like the soundtrack of your life, but like what music has fully impacted you and how it has impacted you?
I don't know if I would ever do that. I mean, I think a little bit of that comes out in the interviews. I think a little bit of that comes out when I was doing Cuts from the Crypt, and maybe will come out in this new thing that I might be doing in a more limited way by playing if I'm playing the music, it's usually music that has been important to me. And if I have time, I will kind of discuss that. In terms of like a documentary about that, I just don't know if anybody would want to see something like that. One thing that was always in my mind from the first book is making like a documentary version of the books, which would be like making a documentary about these composers and about and about music in horror movies. And that's something that's definitely hasn't ruled out. And actually, I can't go into it too much, but it's something that in stepping away from writing and podcasting over these last few months, it's been something that has taken up some more of my attention, and my interest in that has been piqued, because I think in some ways, a lot of the podcasting and even the writing of the books was a very productive procrastination to do something more like a movie. Because that's intimidating. That's more intimidating to me than just sitting down and just talking to somebody and either just for audio or to then transcribe it. But the idea of actually like going out and shooting stuff is very scary. So I think after I put everything down for a bit and I took a couple of weeks without doing anything, in that field, I think I kind of realized like I really should have made this documentary after the first book. And now I'm glad I didn't, because I've learned so much more in the second book, and I've have relationships with so many more composers than I did for the first book. But now that the second book's done, maybe it's time to revisit this idea. So I wouldn't rule it out. Film business is a tough one, and I don't know if I could get something like that funded or find distribution for something like that. But it's definitely something I'm interested in. In terms of something that just kind of is about more personal about me and the music that has kind of impacted my life, I think that comes out in other forms, whether I'm writing about it or podcasting. The podcasting for me, whether it was Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers or even Scored to Death, where I was interviewing composers, it was like, I'm pretty, as you've discovered here, I'm very talkative, but I'm also very open. And so like, they're very personal. Like I've always said, when I was doing Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers, like if somebody from work was like, "Oh, I checked out your podcast," and I was like, "Ugh," because to me, I was like, "You're going to know more about me than I'm ever going to know about you. Like you're going to know about like things me and my friends got into trouble with when we were kids, Like to me, like I'm always very open in the things that I do. So even when I'm writing the books, the introductions to each chapter are often about like how those interviews came to be or why I wanted to interview that person. So that kind of personal stuff I think comes out in other forms for me.
Do you have kind of a favorite moment from the second book? And right away, I want to say without giving away spoilers, but I mean, it is a book, but is there like a moment maybe when you were doing an interview or even putting the book together, did you kind of think, oh, that was really impactful, or holy crap, how did that happen?
Well, for me, when I did the first book, a common question was like, what was your favorite interview? And the truth is like, there really wasn't one. Like all the interviews were different. They all, I think, played a different part in the book. It's as a whole, they each fulfill something different. And as soon as I would start talking about one interview, I'd be like, but then there was this, and and it became very clear that like, I really didn't have favorites. The second book, though largely that way, very quickly in the process of it, like I was extremely fortunate to be able to interview a composer named Robert Cobert, also goes by Bob Cobert in some, in credits for some things. And when I interviewed Bob, he was like 95 or 94, 95. And he was best known to horror fans as the guy who did the music for Dark Shadows, the TV show. But he did like all of Dan Curtis's stuff, who was the producer, director, writer, who did a lot of horror stuff throughout the 70s for television, but he also directed like Burnt Offerings. I knew when I found Bob, which was not easy because it's not like he had a Facebook page and it's not like he still had an agent. Through the detective work that led me to Bob, our first conversation, which was about a half hour long before, wasn't even recorded. It was just me basically calling him to see if we do it, and like, I didn't even tell him why I called until like 20 minutes into the conversation. I was some guy just called him out of the blue. And he and I chatted for like a half an hour. When I did that interview, I realized the importance of it. And it became even more important because sadly he passed away in February of 2020. So before the book even came out, he had passed away. And so it was the role that I have in sharing these guys, these composers' stories, and being trusted with their stories, it's not something I ever took lightly. Um, and I think people that will read the books will see that they are really conversations. They're not really interviews. And when it came to Bob, it was even more important because, like, look, I knew, how much more time do we have with this guy? Even if he lives to be 100, that's only another 5 years. So but the rapport that we had when we did the interview, it just was like, it was amazing. He was so funny. And I think he appreciated like this walk down memory lane, as much, if not more than I did. And we just laughed together, and it sparked a friendship that we talked several times on the phone after that interview. And so doing that interview was, even while I was doing it, I knew it was kind of important. And it's probably the most in-depth interview you'll find with him about his career as a whole. So that was definitely a big one, and that will always be one of my favorite interview, because I can't imagine anything being more fulfilling than that. And not even just like, obviously, that he died and that I got to share his story, like just the fun we had doing that interview. Like, I literally thought he would maybe die on the phone with me because he was laughing so hard. Like, I was worried that he was going to have a heart attack. Like reciting stories about like playing in a jazz band at in this Catskills like resorts when he was 13, like so like it was just so much fun. The other big one of the other Brad Fiedel, who did Terminator, is also in the book, and that was very he was probably the person I was most intimidated to talk to, because like, I mean, this guy scored Terminator and Terminator 2. And I think he was slightly less excited about doing the interview. I mean, he agreed to do it. He was totally nice, like he wasn't a jerk or anything. But during that interview, I could sense him kind of like open up, and like there was almost like you could sense that he was like looking at the clock. And at some point we clicked, and he sent me an email after, complimenting me on the interview, and said that I was looking at this, when you asked this question, that's when I stopped looking at the clock. And so like that was just like very fulfilling, because it was like this guy who I admired so much and was kind of intimidated to talk to, was nice enough to email me afterwards to kind of tell me that he thought I did a good job, and said like, look, sorry, but it was once I think he realized like the kind of interview I wanted to do, or the seriousness I had, or luckily by that point I had like 30 something interviews under my belt with composers. Like definitely I was more comfortable in the second book as an interviewer because of the experience I had with the first book. It was a nice moment to have someone I admired so much recognize it, but also be able to sense it in the moment of like that, when it kind of clicked over, where he was answering the questions, but at some point he became part of the conversation, which was kind of amazing for me.
He could probably feel that you were so passionate about it, and he sort of like, no, it wasn't okay, it's not hokey, it's not nonsense.
Yeah,
because you can feel the passion.
yeah. It's also, I ask a lot of not just questions, but I ask a lot of them, like a time commitment. Like usually I say like, look, it's going to like, I would prefer no less than 90 minutes. It could take up to 2 hours. Charlie Clouser, who's in the book, who did the Saul franchise and so many great scores, the interview in that book, I actually edited down by an hour. He and I talked in one sitting for 4.5 hours. And just for space, really, I ended up cutting about an hour's worth of material out of the interview and tightening it up. So his interview in the book is massive, but it's absolutely fascinating. And I could talk to Charlie for another 4.5 to 8 hours easy. And I've gotten to know Charlie a little bit because I've been one lucky enough to be able to go to California before all this COVID started and got to hang out with him in his studio and chat even more. But Charlie is one of like so many of them, just like very supportive and generous. And so like I've done a couple of panels, one for the Salem Horror Fest, which was about horror film scoring, and one for Fangoria in January, where I brought on some of the composers I know, and we just chat. And Charlie was like, after the first one, he's like, you ever need me for something like this, just tell me, I'm there. And so I've now had a chance to talk to Charlie a few times, with these panels, but also for the interview. So, I mean, like my point is that like, I'm asking more of them than I think the average interviewer is. One, in detail, two, in a time commitment. And I think that makes them hesitant at first, but I think once they realize the passion and that like there's a reason why they're so long, like it's because like I'm trying to get to something deeper than most of the interviews they've probably done. Like I want the stock answers that they've developed over decades of having to talk about it, but I want to know what's behind that answer too. And I think ultimately they come to appreciate that, and I think they also appreciate that I'm trying to help promote them, and I think they appreciate my passion for it. And it's evolved into some great friendships, which is something that was completely unexpected. Like to me, the first book I was a fan. The second book, because I now knew and was friendly with some of the guys from the first book, I was more of a peer in doing the second book. Like I felt more comfortable because now like I have friends like Chris Young and Joseph Fichera and Harry Manfredini. Like these are guys that when I'm in California, like I hang out with. And I don't mean that as like, kind of like showing off, but it ended up being why I think in some ways the second book is even better than the first book, because it made me comfortable in a way that I wasn't in the first book. So when I did the second book, my publisher said to me, the interviews in the second book he's like, I don't know what the word is, mature, maybe. He's like, not that the first book was immature, but he's like, the second book, like you talk more about your own music, which you didn't do in the first book. And it was because of, once I realized that these were just guys and girls, composers, that they're just people. And like, once I got comfortable with them and was able to even have Joe Bishara actually was the go-between with some of the composers in the second book. Like he introduced me to them. Suddenly I'm a friend of a friend and not just some guy blindly emailing. It just changed the dynamic of the interviewing. So in some ways, I think the second book is even better, even though I think a lot of people will be more drawn to like the lineup of the first book because of John Carpenter and Harry Manfredini, like more of the classic. But I'm very proud of the second book, and it wasn't something I thought about consciously. But when it was pointed out that the interviews are different, I was like, well, why are they different? I was like, I guess it's because I wasn't as intimidated, and that was partially experience, but partially getting to know these like wonderful people and realizing that it really is like a great club to know, because they, like I said, like how this all started, which is like they are like the most generous and kind and supportive like group of people that like I've ever met. And so it's led to a lot of good friendships, but also hopefully a lot of great interviews that people will enjoy.
I always think that horror people in general, horror fans, actors, musicians, composers, a lot of times they're the nicest people in the whole world. And being a horror fan myself, like my whole life growing up watching horror movies, and every once in a while there's a person that you'll meet and you start talking about movies and then you bring up horror movies and they're kind of like, but I always found that my horror friends and just doing interviews and talking to people, they're always the nicest people in the world. And they want to share this knowledge and passion and talk about what they're doing and how the creative process works. And it's so inspiring. And I think that's what people don't always get to see. And I think that's with your books. This
Yeah.
is very inspiring to have books about these incredible composers that some people might not even know who they are, or they'll just, oh yeah, that's music from, whatever. But I think it's so, nobody gets enough credit for this. And I think you did an amazing job with this.
I appreciate that because I'm not agreeing with that. I did an amazing job. I am agreeing that they do deserve it and that they're special. And like when I started interviewing them, it was like, I always think of like, when you look at like your sphere of people, or you've interacted with, even if it's just for one interview, like all of a sudden, like this sphere of like talent that I've somehow connected with has grown like in the last 6 years in a way that is like amazing. As someone is creative and aspires to and plays music, certainly a different kind of music than they play, but loves music, loves film, to all of a sudden just like, these are like 30, there's out of both books, there's 30 composers cover. These are like the 30 most talented people I know now. And it was like, that all happened like almost like instantly. And like, yeah, I interviewed some of my guitar heroes when I worked for the blues website. That was amazing. Guys like Steve Cropper and the late Leslie West, who passed away a few months ago. That was amazing. And I interviewed Bruce Campbell a while, years ago for something else. But to then like really sit down and focus on like, okay, like film music, and just focus on those. It was like the amount of talent that these people have is amazing. And I think part of why they're so great, I mean, so nice and so generous, and horror fans in general, I think that we could wax about intellectually about that forever, in terms of like horror movies are catharsis, so they get that out, and like, so, and the passion that fans have, and so we're excited, and it's like kindred spirits when you meet somebody else that's awesome. But with composers, I feel like, and this is just a personal theory that I kind of like formulated over the years of talking to them. A composer who works in cinema is working for some vision. Like they're part of a team. They're not the captain of the team. They're not the coach of the team. They're like the defensive person, like they're like on the line, and and they have like a uniquely creative role in the filmmaking process that you could argue like, okay, cinematographers and stuff, like, yes, it's like there are a lot of creative roles when the writer, obviously, hugely, like that. It's like talk about a field that doesn't get the credit they deserve. Yeah. Maybe that should be the next book. But it's not like it's not like a film music composer is composing music for their own album. It's not an expression of their own like they're not expressing for themselves, they're expressing for somebody else. And I think part of it is like, I don't think you can have an ego with and do that, at least not for any kind of long period of time, and not effectively, because you do, like, they have to kind of like check their ego at the door, because it's not about them, it's not about their music. And in best case scenarios, they get to fulfill their own creative needs while also fulfilling somebody else's. But that other person's needs and the film's needs come above their own creative needs. And I think part of why they're so great is because like it takes a certain kind of person to be able to do that and to do it well. And I don't think you can be a jerk and do that. I don't think you could. I don't think anybody would want to work with you. So I think it's just like the job itself attracts a certain kind of person, and that kind of person that it attracts are just like super nice and generous. And like I said, there's no room for ego in what they do. So they don't have one. So when you talk to them, they're not jerks, and they're like, they recognize that like the amount of support that they've given the books is also something that was completely unexpected. When I did a book signing for the first book, 5 of them came out to sign the book with me. I went to California to sell the book at a convention, and Harry Manfredini and Chris Young came out for free to just like help me sell the book and sign books. Of course, with COVID, I haven't been able to have a book signing, but Dark Delicacies in California, I sent them, like stickers, labels with my signature. But then, like Holly Amber Church and Chris Young, who wrote the afterword for the second book. He's not interviewed in the second book, but he wrote the afterword for John Massari, who's in the second book, Charlie Clouser, who's in the second book. They went and signed the book, to help promote it, on their own.
That's awesome.
During COVID, they went in, they signed like 25, 30 books for me, but also for Dell, because, everybody in that area who loves horror movies knows the bookstore Dark Delicacies. And so they've signed stuff there before, but just an amazing, supportive group of people. And yes, anything I can do to get the word out about them, I will do and have been doing. So I appreciate, that's a long way of saying thank you for your compliment.
And the books are available on Amazon. And do you think you would do kind of like can people get you to sign the book to get out?
Yes, if they're available on Amazon. Second book had a hard time getting on Amazon. It was weird, but now they seem to be available on both of them seem to be available on. I do have some copies, and if you really want a signed copy from me, you can go to scoredtodeath.com, and there's a way to kind of order the book there, or you can always just contact me on social media at Scored to Death, and we can work it out. The real difference is that like I charge shipping, whereas if you have Prime, you don't have to. But usually, like, some people have ordered both books, and it's basically like media mail is like $5. So it's kind of shipping's $5 for one book, or shipping's also $5 for 2 books for people that have picked up both books. There's also like a Kindle version of the first book, and I'm sure a Kindle version, like an ebook version of the second book, is on the way. It just hasn't come out yet for people that are interested in it in that way.
Very cool. Well, you've answered all my questions, and it was such an honor to talk to you. And I'm excited to read both of these. I want to read them.
Well, thank you.
Very talented, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me for horrornews.net. And any final words of wisdom or anything else you want to say?
Just to thank you. I mean, this was a real pleasure. I am very talkative. I usually warn people ahead of time. And I appreciate the promotion, and I obviously appreciate everybody out there who has been very supportive of both books. And the people, one of the things that was amazing that I didn't know was going to happen with the first book is that people like post pictures of the book when they get it on social media, and it was like, oh, there's like my baby's out there. Like, people, and that was fantastic. So I would just say thank you to everybody who not only supports the books, but also supports all these great record labels that are putting out this music, and of course that are supportive of all composers. So thank you, and thank you for talking to me about it. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Blake, and stay safe and keep making amazing work.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.